Hi, it's Nikki Phoenix from True to Self YouTube channel, and I'm on a roll today, so I really wanted to dive into the teaching about self, very importantly. It's related to my last week's YouTube, which was Spirituality in 5 Minutes, and I think it's time that I elaborated on those 3 points. For those of you who didn't see last week's YouTube, you can go back and see it. But an overview is spirituality in 3 points. Number one, God is life in the spirit of love. Number two, the meaning of the Bible is believe in yourself because you are sent. And number three, the emotional body, this is the spiritual body, meaning you have to clear it in order to connect with God and believe in yourself. All in a nice little package tied up in a bow. Right, but what does all of that mean? So, of course, self is really huge, very, very important. And I'm a bit short of breath. I have my little board to keep me on track and to show you the self. And why specifically the hugely controversial issue, and why the church gets it wrong. Why does the church get it so wrong? And it is my diagnosis that this is the singular and greatest thing that is the number one, that the church is missing, and number two, that is turning people away from churches. It is removing the spiritual quality of the Christian message. And it has, without it, it limits, without this understanding that I'm going to explain to you now, the Christian message becomes one-dimensional. It becomes only about Jesus, and it removes Jesus from our hearts and puts him still on the cross, and removes him from a connection where there's no relativity. It's really important that we gain that relativity, that Christ and Jesus was us. He was a human, he was a man. And the interpretation of the Christian doctrine as it is right now removes that connection. So in very serious spiritual terms, the interpretation of the Christian doctrine currently in the church is cauterizing. It is removing the umbilical cord between the spiritual umbilical cord between ourselves and God. That's a fairly serious situation, and it is a big claim that I'm making. So let me go on to explain to you. I'll tell you what the problem is. First of all, I want to tell you, it says here, the mind is a weapon and a sword. I need to just establish that fact first of all, because why is it that millions and millions of people who go to church, Christians, walk out of there and go, I'm expected to remove my brain. I'm like the church wants to do a frontal lobotomy on me when I walk in there. I'm expected not to think. I must just categorically accept everything that they say, blind faith and all that. And actually, it's dumbing me down. Now, we've had 2,000 years of this. And even the study of that history is in and of itself fascinating. But that is where millions of people are today, unless you are just able to just comply and tap into the goodness that is there, which is very powerful because Jesus Christ is the most powerful prophet that ever lived. And certainly, I won't even diminish it by saying that, yes, he is the Son of God. But that's only half the story, right? We were talking about half the story. So back to the mind as a weapon and a sword. We were given a brain for a reason. God didn't make our minds to not serve him in its natural state. Our mind is a sword. When it is discerning, it cuts, it deciphers, it cuts away, it separates, and it cleaves through information. Our mind is an exquisite weapon and sword, and it needs to be properly conditioned for its true purpose. I need to establish that first and foremost, because that is something that the current doctrine of the Christian church has been robbing of us. Because we need that mind, I need to establish that fact up front, because I need you to use that mind in this conundrum of why the church is getting it wrong. And not entirely wrong, otherwise I wouldn't bother with them. Would I? No, because Jesus Christ is who he said he was, but so much more. So you take your sword, which is your mind, and I'm telling you that when it comes to the issue of self, see if this makes sense. Test this in your own firing furnace of your own mind. The church does not differentiate. The church does not differentiate. Now, let me explain what I mean by that. 2 weeks ago, when I was in church, there was a very well-informed, highly educated woman giving the sermon, and she is a therapist, and she works with people, both secular and Christian, and she gave a sermon about the misguided secular culture that we live in, that is always about self-determination, self-truth, sorry, those were the harder guys, self-truth, self-empowerment, self-everything. She had an impressive list. I have to give that to her. And I sat there and it burnt my soul. It was like putting a torch on my soul. It was such a tragedy, because here in this beautiful place with this amazing community, there is this humdrum, ongoing rhetoric about the bad self, the bad self, the bad self, and how self is bad. No. Because why? The church does not differentiate between the bad self and the good self. The bad self and the good self. And this is where you need to put your mind and cleave between the two. And that's the extraordinary thing about language. It's common sense. Phew, there's so many ways to explain this. I'm just going to keep it as clean and simple as possible. But it is common sense that any weapon in the wrong hands is destructive. But put that weapon or that mechanism or that machine in the right hands, and great things can be achieved. Perfect example is the atomic bomb. It was used to murder millions of people in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in the Second World War. But it has equally been implemented economically and industrially to create nuclear power. This is a truism about life. The self is a weapon. The self is a very powerful God-made creation, the entire self. And we are given the greatest blessing of all, autonomy, freedom of thought, we are given freedom. Even Christ talks about that freedom, our entitlement to that freedom. We need to differentiate between the bad self and the good self. to always talk about self as bad has single-handedly suppressed generations of human beings on this planet. It's why we have a mental health crisis. It's why we have broken hearts. It's why we are not productive. It's why we have so much evil in the world, because on the most fundamental, doctrinal, spiritual, religious level, we have been told we are all bad, that the self is bad. But there has been such a hunger for self-discovery, which is God discovery, by the way, in its true form. But we've been so suppressed by this, everything that has to do with the self is bad. It is truly, in my mind, the greatest cosmic tragedy of humanity that ever has been, because Christ came to show us that we are God's children. We are God's sons and daughters of the living God, which makes us family with God, which makes us, take away the one O, good. Not all good, only if we align our goodness with God and we make that choice, because we have that freedom of choice. But the church has made the grave, and I mean grave, error of eliminating everything about self. And that's why they don't understand the self-help movement. Hello, why do we have the self-help movement? Why is it aligned to uncovering internal spiritual law and learnings and yoga and all these beautiful spiritual practices that make us accountable and responsible for God within? And that is the true Christ who is within. And somehow the New Age movement has been cleaved away from Christ, from Jesus. But that's because of the limited mindset and understanding of the church. And yeah, so I've also written here that the bad self is one-dimensional. The good self is multidimensional, because the good self is the God self. That's why the New Age movement calls it our higher selves. But it takes some doing to suppress the bad self, to take charge of our animal aspect, our human flesh animal instinct, and subjugate it to the higher self. And because the bad self, being one-dimensional, is only flesh. It's only of animal. But since we are spiritual beings having a physical experience, which is linked to the bad self, the animal instinct, but in balance, when this is subjugated in order of priority, then we have health. That's when the so-called bad self melts away and is able to be subjugated to the good self. So not all self is bad. And we have been suffering from this suppression of self, because at the end of the day, when we suppress self, the true self, because this is the true self, this is also true, but just in the lower sense. That's why the New Age movement talks about energy levels. It's not my language, but I understand the logic. But when we edify the good self, this is who we truly are. When we're really talking about self, at the end of the day, we're talking about God, because that part is just subject to. And what does it amount to in my book? It's an audacious thing to say, but the church is suppressing God. The church is denying God. The church is denying the truth and denying the God that is in us and allowing that God to flourish and come out. And my favorite saying of all, the church takes us and leads us and points us to the gates of paradise and slams the door in our faces. Because on the other side of every promise and every teaching that is true in the church, every one of it is true. But only on the other side can we truly experience it. Only when we recognize the God self, the good self in us, and we give it credence, and we give it health, and we give it life. And we understand the spiritual law of how the bad self must be sacrificed and surrendered to the good self. And therein lies the Christ story. He died unto his flesh in order that his spirit may reign supreme in that universal truth, that we all are required to do. We are to die unto our flesh selves so that we may enter our higher selves, our God selves, our God identity. And that is why, my friends, everything about the self is not bad. It's not bad. And it's time to love ourselves. Any decent psychologist or therapist, this is what just confused me, that woman should give a sermon with those kind of words. Does she know what she's saying? Self-love is the foundation of mental health. Self-love, true self-love, not narcissistic self-love. Nobody said anything about that. It's amazing how the church just defaults to the evil part of human nature, which is undoubtedly there. But we've had it so shoved down our throats for 2 centuries. I don't know about you, but I'm done with it. Because this self here, this self wants to love, this self needs to receive love, this self wants to live life to the fullest. And none of us can do it on our own. It's a collective and communal exercise. If I do it, you got to do it. It's only the secular world that tells us we have to do it individually. So there goes the teaching for the self for today. And I hope that gives you something to think about. And I'm learning about how to communicate this. So I hope you're going to show up, and please give me a thumbs up and send me a little message, any of your thoughts. If you want me to clarify anything, please pop a message in the message box. And I'll see you tomorrow. Bye.